Insperity presents the Small Business Advocate Show with Jim Blasingame, brought to you by FedEx, CareerBuilder.com, and Palo Alto Software. This is a copyrighted production of Small Business Network, Inc., all rights reserved.
You're listening to the man who's screaming from the rooftops for the big banks to help out America's small businesses, the Robin Hood of small business.
Now, don't be sore at the banks. Hell, we fired our CEO, and he barely got out with $50 million.
That poor man, is he okay?
Well, as okay as you can be in the north of France.
Jim Blasingame, the small business advocate.
Welcome back, 34 after the hour. Thank you very much for joining me. Thanks for hanging out with me. I'm not in the north of France myself. I'm out here with you, small business owners, out here in flyover America and out here on Main Street where the rubber meets the road, just like you are. And we got somebody who's joined us now and who spends a lot of time out here on Main Street herself and reports from there, is our good friend Nicole Gelinas. Nicole is the Searle Freedom Trust Fellow at the Manhattan Institute, and also a contributing editor to City Journal, and the author of a very important book this year after the fall, Saving Capitalism from Wall Street and Washington. And she's our good friend Nicole Gelinas. Welcome back to the show.
Good morning, Jim. Thanks for having me back.
It's good to have you back, Nicole. One of the things that we heard about, kind of in the abstract, over the last decade, is this concept of too big to fail. Yeah. I remember hearing, and you write about this in your book. There's a whole chapter, at least one chapter in your book about this. But I remember hearing both of the Fed chairmen, Greenspan and the new one, talking about too big to fail. Other people on the talking head financial shows, somebody talking about too big to fail. And typically, when they talked about too big to fail, they were talking about Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac, as I remember. And they didn't talk about Merrill Lynch. They didn't talk about Bank of America. They weren't necessarily talking about those banks. They were talking about these government sponsored entities, GSEs, like Freddie Mae and Freddie Mac. But before, when I was talking about this, they were in the abstract because it hasn't happened yet. We just wondered if there was such an animal that was actually too big to fail. Now we know that we actually had those. We actually experienced that, and we're dealing with the aftermath, aren't we?
Well, sure. You know how sometimes the old saying is when the public figures out to buy a particular stock, it's time to sell it. Same thing, hopefully, with too big to fail, that as soon as too big to fail entered the public lexicon a couple of years ago, hopefully that would be the death knell of it, although we haven't seen that yet. What happened was, back in the 1980s, you had financial firms. You had the first large bank that was considered to be too big to fail. You had a bank called Continental Illinois out of Illinois, out of Chicago, the eighth largest bank in the nation. It started to teeter and it go under, and the Reagan administration, the FDIC, the Fed decided we can't let this bank go under. It would cause global turmoil, and so they stepped in and guaranteed all of the bondholders to this institution. Mm-hmm. And at the time, small bank lobbyists, other kind of small-scale financial institutions said this financial institution is too big to fail, and if we don't fix this problem, eventually other financial institutions will be too big to fail, and the buck will eventually stop with the taxpayer.
Right.
And no one really listened to them.
So it became a conceptual debate, but nothing really was done about it.
Right, and you had debate about this, throughout the 80s, throughout the S&L crisis of the late 1980s, early 1990s. Mm-hmm. And nothing was really done about this. And then you had, in the late 1990s, you had the first hedge fund that was too big to fail, the long-term capital management.
Right, that was in 98.
Right, where you had the bondholders to anonymous hedge fund, not anonymous, but unheard of in the public and in the financial community, really. The Fed had to step in and engineer a bailout of the bondholders. And financial industry knew fund is too big to fail, the government would never let an investment bank fail.
And so there's been this big debate about whether the government should be getting involved, whether we should allow companies. How do we prevent companies from getting to that point? Folks, we're talking about the concept of being too big to fail, of the marketplace allowing, and maybe the government facilitating this, like with Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac, and the concept of too big to fail. What do we do about that? And that's something that Nicole and I are going to talk about in the next couple of seconds. We're going to talk some specifics. We're going to let Nicole get into some specifics about this and why this matters, why this is important, why you and I as small business owners should be paying attention to this, and we should be weighing in on this discussion, on this debate, on the policies that are around this issue, because it affects you and me, our ability to capitalize our small businesses, either directly or indirectly. 2010, stay with us. We'll be right back.
Insperity presents the Small Business Advocate Show with Jim Blasingame, brought to you by FedEx, CareerBuilder.com, and Palo Alto Software. This is a copyrighted production of Small Business Network, Inc., intended for the private use of our audience. Except as otherwise provided by copyright law, all other copying, redistribution, or publication without prior written consent is prohibited. All rights reserved. Prohibited. All rights reserved. Prohibited.